Earth was no longer a world of nations and borders. It was a graveyard of forgotten cities, abandoned monuments, and hollowed-out husks of civilization. The wars had come first, splintering governments into fractured remnants. Then the plagues had swept through, leaving bodies in the streets and orphaned children in the ruins. By the time the stars revealed their secret, that humanity was not alone, Earth was already weak, ripe for the taking. The HFY arrived like carrion birds, not with an armada but with quiet efficiency. There was no need for an invasion, no armies, no declaration of war. They came in the night, their ships dark against the sky, their presence marked only by the absence they left behind. Children vanished from the skeletons of cities, swept into the bellies of ships, and carried off-world before a single alarm could be raised. In the rusting remains of what had once been Chicago, Lena huddled in the shell of a burned-out car. Her breath shallow as the sky above her rippled unnaturally. The airship passed overhead, silent, predatory. She had seen it before. She had seen the others go. One by one, no one returned. Beside her, Eli pressed a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay silent. He was older, 12 to her 10, and in this world that made him a veteran of survival. He had been the first to notice the patterns. How the HFY theory only came for those without guardians, how they moved through the ruins with the precision of hunters, how they always knew where to look. The children had tried hiding in the subway tunnels, but the slavers had found them. They had tried running, but no human legs could outpace the machines. A scream shattered the silence. Not far, perhaps a street away. A girl's voice, shrill with terror, and then cut short. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to become as small as the shadow she hid in. Her stomach twisted, but she did not move. She had learned. To move was to be seen. To be seen was to be taken. Eli's fingers tightened around hers. They waited, barely daring to breathe, as the shadows of their hunters swept through the street. The capture was swift. It always was. The HFY theory did not waste time. A pulse of blue light flared, illuminating the crumbling concrete, and then the sound of something heavy being dragged. Then silence. Lena exhaled shakily. She could feel Eli tense beside her, could feel the urge to do something radiating from him. But there was nothing to be done. No one fought the slavers. No one ever came back. Until now. Callum Voss had been tracking the HFY theory for years, and he had learned one undeniable truth. They were arrogant. They moved through the remnants of Earth like they owned it, convinced that no one would stand against them. And for the most part, they were right. The survivors were too scattered, too weak, too afraid. But Callum was not afraid. He moved like a ghost through the abandoned husk of New York, a city he had once known before it fell to ruin. His weapons were scavenged from the dead, his armor pieced together from scraps of old wars and stolen alien technology. He had no army, no backup, no illusions of heroism, only a mission. He had been a soldier once, long before the world collapsed. Before the HFY theory took his sister, she had been 8 years old. He had buried the world with her. Now he lived for one thing, to make them pay. Through the cracked visor of his helmet, he watched the slaver ship descend in the distance. The same pattern, the same precision. They would land, sweep the area, and leave with their cargo. He had seen it too many times. Tonight, he would change the outcome. In the belly of the descending ship, Lena and Eli clung to each other, their wrists bound with cold metal, their fellow captives trembling in silence. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar machinery, the walls pulsing with faint, sickly light. No words were spoken between them. What was there to say? The HFY theory moved through the hold with calculated indifference. Tall reptilian, their scales gleaming under artificial light. They did not look at their captives as individuals. They were cargo, product. One of the slavers paused near Lena, an electronic device flickering in its clawed grip. It scanned her, let out a low, guttural click, and moved on. Eli's jaw tightened. "They're sorting us," he whispered. Lena did not ask what that meant. She did not want to know. Above them, unseen, Callum was already inside. The ship's security was built to keep creatures in, not out. It was a mistake the HFY Story had made before, and one they would pay for now. He moved through the corridors with quiet efficiency, a knife in one hand, a stolen plasma pistol in the other. The slavers did not know they had already lost. Callum moved like a shadow through the belly of the HFY ship, his breath steady, his heartbeat a slow, controlled rhythm. The corridors pulsed with dim blue light, organic veins of alien technology threading through the walls, feeding power to systems he didn't understand and didn't need to. All he needed was a direction, the cargo hold, where the children were kept. A single HFY Story slaver patrolled ahead, its reptilian frame shifting fluidly in the dimness, its clawed fingers idly tapping against the hilt of a sheathed weapon. Callum closed the distance in 3 silent strides, his knife flashing in the low light. A sharp, wet gurgle, and then the slaver was gone, its body dragged into the shadows before the ship could take notice. He had studied them, the way they moved, the way they killed, the way they underestimated him. They weren't soldiers. They were traffickers, traders of flesh, accustomed to terrified captives who never fought back. That mistake had cost them before. It would cost them again tonight, in the cold, sterile depths of the cargo hold. Lena and Eli sat shoulder to shoulder, their wrists still bound, their minds racing. The HFY Story had moved some of the others to another section of the ship, whispering in their guttural, inhuman tongues. What happened to those who were taken deeper, no one knew. No one ever returned. "We have to do something," Eli murmured. Lena swallowed hard, shaking her head. "We can't." But Eli wasn't listening. He had seen something. Just for a second, a flicker of movement in the upper vents. A shape that did not belong. A shape that had killed before. Callum Voss. Eli had never met him, but the stories were whispered among the survivors. A man who hunted slavers the way wolves hunted prey. A man whose rage had carried him beyond reason, beyond humanity, into something else. Eli's lips parted. A spark of hope lit behind his eyes. He nudged Lena. "Someone's here." She didn't understand, not fully, but she trusted him. Trusted his instincts. And when she looked up, her breath caught. A shape moved in the shadows above, too fast, too precise to be one of the slavers. Then the lights flickered and hell broke loose. The first explosion rocked the ship, a controlled detonation somewhere deep in its systems, sending the HFY Story into a frenzy. The cargo hold doors hissed open as 2 slavers stormed in, their weapons drawn, their cold, yellow eyes scanning for the threat. They never saw it. A gunshot, muffled but lethal, punched through the first slaver's skull, sending it sprawling. The second whirled, but Callum was already upon it, his blade flashing once, twice, clean, efficient. The slaver hit the floor, twitching, its lifeblood pooling beneath it. For a moment, silence. Then the children began to stir, gasping, their fear battling against disbelief. Eli was the first to move, scrambling toward the bodies, his fingers prying desperately at the dead slaver's belt. A pulse key. He snatched it, turning to Lena, his breath ragged. "We can get out." Callum's voice was low, edged with steel. "Not yet." The children froze. For the first time, they saw him clearly, tall, lean, clad in a patchwork of battle-worn armor, his face half hidden by a rebreather mask, his eyes cold and sharp as knives. "More of them," he murmured, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something beyond their hearing. "Coming fast." Eli swallowed. "Then we run." Callum turned toward him, something dark flickering in his expression. "No, we fight." Lena's hands trembled as Eli fumbled with the pulse key, the metal cuffs around their wrists clicking open one by one. The other children, barely more than ghosts in the dim light, edged closer, eyes wide, hungry for direction. Callum took a step forward, his voice low but clear. "Listen to me. This ship isn't going to make it to its destination, but we have to move now." Lena found her voice, small but certain. "You're here to save us." Callum didn't answer. He didn't believe in salvation. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. The HFY were coming. More this time, armored, weapons humming with deadly energy. Callum moved before the children could react. A grenade clinked against the floor, rolled toward the doorway. A sharp, deafening blast. Screeches of pain. Smoke flooded the air. Then Callum was in the doorway, his gun kicking in his hands, each shot precise, lethal. The slavers faltered, unprepared for resistance, let alone slaughter. Eli lunged for a fallen weapon, his hands shaking, his breath ragged. He had never fired a gun before. But tonight, that would change. Lena grabbed his wrist. "Don't." His eyes flashed. "If we don't, we die." Callum didn't glance back. He already knew what the boy would choose. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "Move when I say." Then they ran, through the smoke, over bodies, down the winding corridors of the ship, towards something that smelled like freedom. Alarms blared. The HFY were regrouping, their hunters closing in. But Callum was already 3 steps ahead. He always was. Because this wasn't a rescue. This was a war. The air was thick with tension as Callum and the children navigated the maze of corridors deeper into the heart of the ship. With every step, the pulsating hum of the HFY vessel seemed to press against their minds, each vibration a reminder of the threat that loomed over them. Callum's hand clenched around the weapon at his side, his eyes scanning every corner, every flickering light. It wasn't just a ship they were fighting against. It was the very darkness that had consumed the galaxy, the darkness that the HFY had brought with them. The children were silent, save for their soft footsteps. Most were too exhausted to speak, their faces gaunt with fear, their eyes wide with the shock of what they had seen. But there was one among them, Lena, whose gaze burned with something more. It wasn't just fear. It was a spark of rebellion, a fire that had survived in her since the moment the slavers had taken her. The group moved cautiously, but they couldn't outrun the feeling that they were being watched. Callum felt it too, a presence lingering in the shadows, waiting. His grip tightened on his weapon as they rounded another corner, and that's when he saw it. A door, barely visible in the dim light, its edges glowing faintly as though alive. It was different from the other doors they had encountered. This one pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if it was tied to the very heartbeat of the ship. "This way," Callum muttered, gesturing for the others to follow. His voice was low, edged with urgency. They had no time to waste. Lena gave a small nod, but her eyes flicked toward the hallway behind them. She felt it too. Something was following them. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice. Their only hope lay beyond that door. When they reached it, Callum hesitated for a fraction of a second, his senses on high alert. He placed his hand on the glowing panel beside the door, and the ship responded with a low hiss. The door sliding open to reveal a vast chamber beyond. A dim, sickly green light bathed the room in an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the floor. The walls seemed to breathe, the very metal of the ship shifting as though it had a pulse of its own. The center of the room held a large platform, and upon it were the pod-like structures that Callum had dreaded seeing. There was no mistaking it. These were the pods the HFY used for their experiments. Inside each, a form shifted and writhed, a twisted mockery of life. Some were human, others were barely recognizable, mutated beyond recognition. But all of them shared the same hollow, tortured look in their eyes that screamed without sound. Lena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the sight. The horror of it was beyond words. These weren't just the kidnapped children. They were the remnants of those who had already been through the HFY's cruel process, twisted into something else entirely. Why are they doing this? Lena's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes wide with disbelief. Callum stepped forward, his face hardening. "It's not just slaving, Lena. It's experimentation. They're trying to perfect the human form. They see us as nothing but raw material to be shaped and altered until we fit their idea of perfection. Eli, who had been silent up until now, looked away from the pods, his face pale. But why? What could they possibly want with us? They want control, Callum said, his voice cold. They want to turn us into something we can't fight back against. We're nothing but tools in their hands. But we don't have to let them win. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, sharp and deliberate, growing louder by the second. Callum's heart skipped a beat. It was too late to leave without being noticed. They had been discovered. Before he could react, a deep voice resonated through the chamber, smooth and commanding. So, the humans have come to the heart of the ship. How predictable. Callum's hand instinctively went to his weapon, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as Vorkesh emerged from the shadows, his towering figure framed in the doorway. The HFY captain's black eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he observed them, his long, sharp claws flexing at his sides. "You're too late," Vorkesh said, his voice a low growl. "You've walked right into my domain. This is where all your struggles end. This is where your kind ceases to be a threat." Lena's breath caught in her throat, but she held her ground. Callum could see the fire in her eyes. The same fire he'd seen in himself all those years ago when he'd first sworn to fight back against the HFY. "We won't let you get away with this," Callum said, his voice steady, even though his pulse raced. Vorkesh's lips curled into a cruel smile. "You think you have a choice? You think you can stop what has already been set in motion? I have perfected the process. You are nothing more than the last vestiges of a dying species. Soon, there will be nothing left of you. Nothing but us." Callum's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to let you turn these kids into experiments. I'll burn this ship to the ground if I have to." Vorkesh's smile widened. "You don't understand, do you? This isn't just about you, or your pathetic rebellion. This is evolution. This is the future of the galaxy." A flicker of movement caught Callum's eye, and he turned just in time to see a pod slowly opening. The creature inside it was tall and thin, its body almost skeletal, but its eyes were alive, too alive, burning with a hunger that no human could understand. It stepped forward, its limbs creaking as if unused to movement. It had been born in this chamber, twisted from the remnants of those who had come before. Callum's fingers tightened around his weapon. The battle had just begun. The escape pod shot away from the HFY ship, its engines firing with a low hum as it propelled them through the vast emptiness of space. Callum didn't relax as the distance between them and the monstrous vessel grew. His fingers gripped the armrest of his seat, knuckles pale with tension. He stared out of the pod's viewport, watching as the HFY ship slowly shrank into the abyss, but in the pit of his stomach, he could feel the weight of the battle that still loomed. Behind him, Lena and the others were still in shock, their faces pale and exhausted from the horrors they'd witnessed. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the quiet whir of the pod systems. Eli sat beside him, his breathing steady but strained, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. They had managed to escape, but they all knew this was only the beginning of what would be a long and perilous journey. Their fight wasn't over, and the HFY would not let them go so easily. Lena, still holding on to the side of her seat, glanced at Callum. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a fragile whisper, barely audible over the hum of the pod. "Did we win?" Callum met her gaze, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened. He had seen the fire in her eyes. There was a strength in her that he admired, something that reminded him of himself before he had been broken by the war. But now, that same fire burned with uncertainty. They had escaped, but the cost had been high. They were free, but not really. Not yet. "No," Callum said quietly. "We've only won a battle. The war is still out there, and it's coming for us." Eli turned to face him, his face grim, his eyes still calculating. "We're not safe. Even if we're out of the HFY ship's range, there's no telling how long before they send reinforcements. They'll track us down, and when they do, we won't be able to fight them off without backup. The thought hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Callum knew Eli was right. They were in uncharted space, far from the alliances that could help them, surrounded by enemies who had far more resources at their disposal. The odds were stacked against them. Still, they had one thing the HFY didn't: determination. "Then we make our own way," Callum said firmly, his voice unwavering. "We'll find a way to fight back. We won't hide, and we won't be afraid." Lena nodded slowly, a flicker of resolve returning to her eyes. She looked around at the other children, most of them still traumatized, still trying to come to grips with the atrocities they'd witnessed. But Callum could see the spark of something in their faces. They weren't lost. They were survivors. "We need to get to a safe place," Eli said, breaking the silence that had fallen over them. His voice was strained, but his eyes burned with the same determination. "I can send a distress signal to any friendly vessels in the area, but we have to find a place to hide first. Somewhere the HFY won't think to look. We'll need supplies," Callum replied, shifting his attention back to the navigation controls. "And a place to regroup. I know a few old military outposts we can use. They're abandoned, but they should be equipped enough to help us get started." "Military outposts?" Lena's voice was laced with skepticism. "Are you sure they're still secure? After everything the HFY have done, are you sure we won't be walking right into another trap?" Callum turned to her, his eyes filled with the weight of years of war. "I know the risks, Lena, but if there's even a chance they're still standing, we take it. The outposts were designed to withstand just about anything, and they're far off the beaten path. The HFY won't be looking there." Eli leaned forward, fingers flying over the pod's console. "I can make it work. I'll start sending out the distress signal to a few military contacts. If anyone's still out there, we'll know soon enough." For a moment, all they could do was wait. The silence between them stretched thin, broken only by the soft hum of the escape pod's engine and the quiet beeping of the console as Eli worked. Callum kept his eyes on the vastness of space outside the viewport, his mind running through the possibilities. There was so much to do, so much more to prepare for, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Then, without warning, the pod lurched violently. Callum's heart leapt into his throat, and he grabbed the control panel as the ship rocked back and forth. The children screamed, some clutching at their seats, others looking around in panic. "Eli!" Callum shouted, his voice sharp with command. "What's happening?" Eli's fingers flew over the console, his face a mask of concentration. "It's not us. Someone's hacking into our systems." His voice tightened. "It's the HFY. They've found us already. Can you fight them off?" Callum demanded, his jaw clenched. He had seen this before. He knew what it meant when the HFY started intercepting transmissions. They weren't going to let them go that easily. Eli's face twisted with frustration as he worked the controls. "I'm trying, but they're good. Too good. They're scrambling the system. If I don't get this under control, they'll disable the pod before we even get a chance to escape." Lena's eyes flashed with fear, but she held her ground. "What do we do now?" "We fight," Callum said, standing up and moving toward the back of the pod where the weapons were stored. "I don't care if it's just a handful of us. We fight, and we make them regret ever coming after us." He turned toward the children, his voice low but steady. "This isn't over. We won't let them break us. We're still alive, and as long as we are, we will fight back. They might have won battles, but they haven't won this war. Not yet." The pod continued to shake, and Callum knew that the moment of reckoning was upon them. They were being hunted, but they wouldn't be hunted quietly. They would make the HFY regret underestimating humanity. "Prepare yourselves," he said, as he opened the weapons compartment. "This is our fight now." With weapons in hand, the children began to find their resolve. Their faces hardened with determination. They were survivors, and they would not be prey any longer. The battle was far from over. The war for their freedom had just begun, And Callum would make sure they didn't lose another inch to the XY theory.